Did you know there was almost another Pokemon Pinball for Nintendo DS? It was being developed by the same team that made Metroid Prime Pinball and was scheduled to launch on Nintendo DS around the same time as Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. It would have been the most ambitious in the series. In previous games, you only got to collect Pokemon, but in this one, you'd actually get to battle them. Players would travel from city to city catching Pokemon along the routes, build a team of their favorites, then fight against gym leaders on double-ended pinball tables. The Pokemon Company said they were the best graphics they'd ever seen outside Japan, but unfortunately, the game was never finished. We managed to get an inside scoop from one of the developers, and we'll tell you all about it. But first, we need to provide some historical context. The first two pinball titles were developed by Jupiter Corporation, who also made some of the franchise's more obscure spin-offs, like the Pokemon Pikachu accessory. The original Pokemon Pinball released on Game Boy in 1999, challenging fans to obtain high scores and collect all 151 Pokemon. It was well received critically and commercially, but only included two pinball tables, one called Red and the other one Blue. On the red table, you caught Pokemon by firing the ball into Bellsprout's mouth, hitting 6 Voltorb bumpers to reveal it, then striking the Pokemon 3 times to catch it. The blue table had a slightly different design but followed the same formula, with Cloyster replacing Bellsprout and Shelder bumpers instead of Voltorb. Whenever you started a new game, a random location was chosen via the slot machine in the middle. It didn't change the table's design, instead it only changed which Pokemon you could catch during that session. For example, you'd only see Charmander in Pallet Town and Articuno in the Seafoam Islands. In 2003, a sequel called Pokemon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire released on Game Boy Advance. The graphics were better, and it featured about 50 more Pokemon than its predecessor, but it still only had 2 pinball tables, and gameplay was mostly unchanged compared to the Game Boy original. After 2003, the Pokemon Pinball series just kinda died off, and there were no signs the Pokemon Company ever had plans to develop another sequel. Well, up until last year, that is. In July 2021, a huge leak of hacked Nintendo data dropped on 4chan, including an internal spreadsheet showing a list of games that, as of 2005, were currently in development. One of those games was a new Pokemon Pinball for Nintendo DS, which it described as having Wi-Fi features and a target release date of September 2006, the same month Pokemon Diamond and Pearl launched in Japan. Under the column identifying its developer, it simply said Fuse. We figured this was probably referring to Fuse Games, the small British developer who made Mario Pinball Land and Metroid Prime Pinball. They went out of business in 2009, but all 9 members are still out there somewhere, so we reached out to all of them. And after a few weeks of brick walls and dead ends, we finally managed to get the full story from Fuse Games artist Matthew Nightingale. But before we get into that, a word from this episode's sponsor, the fantasy RPG Bloodline, Heroes of Lithas. The most brutal damage dealers in the world of Lithas, the sleek Lycan Clan Gultung, are coming to the game this Christmas. You can combine this new lineage of bloodlines with the existing ones, like elves, demigods, orcs, and dwarves to get even stronger hybrids and create unique, legendary champions. For a limited time, players can get a Gultung champion for free by participating in the Christmas event starting December 22nd. Players can also battle in the new Valley of Conquerors on brand new maps and earn legendary hybrids. In the first season, conquer territories with your guild members and claim the champion Scarlet, a rare combo of demigod and vampire. Get her for free by simply gathering your team and beating your foes. New bloodlines and legendary hybrids are constantly being released, so there's endless possibilities to make champions that suit your style. You can download Bloodline for free on Android and iOS, and even get a special starter pack worth $20 by using our link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. This'll get you 100,000 gold, 100 diamonds, and 3 stamina potions. And don't forget, starting December 22nd, participating players can get a free Lycan champion from the Gultung clan. Give it a try. And now back to Pokemon. According to Matthew, Diamond and Pearl Pinball would have been more of an adventure game, similar to Fuse's previous game, Metroid Prime Pinball. Before we dig into the details, let's take a brief look at Fuse's Metroid game, as it'll help you imagine how their Pokemon game would have functioned. Metroid Prime Pinball was a story-based adaptation of the GameCube title that played out across 6 tables. Samus starts out on the pirate frigate where she occasionally decurls from her morph ball to shoot Metroids, parasites, and space pirates. Then she heads to the TALLON overworld, where if her morph ball hits the right spot, you can play a wall-jumping minigame that nets a Chozo artifact. Next, it's on to the Phendrana Drifts to get the power bombs and fight Thartis, followed by the Phazon Mines where Samus obtains the missiles and fights a small army of space pirates along with their leader, the Omega Pirate. After collecting 12 artifacts in those first 4 stages, you'll unlock the Artifact Temple where you have to get 6 Morph Balls into tower slots while Meta Ridley tries to stop you. And then in the last stage, you're tasked with killing the final boss, Metroid Prime. That's an oversimplification of a pretty complex game, but the takeaway here is that Metroid Prime Pinball was a linear adventure with incredibly clever implementations of Metroid series mechanics, and Diamond and Pearl Pinball was on course to follow the same overall formula, but with Pokémon mechanics. Matthew Nightingale was an artist on Metroid Pinball, and he served in the same position for Diamond and Pearl Pinball. He says he believes it was the high quality of their Metroid adaptation that led to the Pokémon Company, together with representatives from Nintendo, to come pay a visit to Fuse's office in Burford, England. A few years earlier, when Nintendo asked Fuse to make a Metroid game, before entering full production, Fuse built a playable demo to show Nintendo what the full game would look like. The demo they presented was the Pirate Frigate, which eventually became the first stage in the game's final build. After Fuse wrapped up development on Metroid Prime Pinball, Nintendo paid them to build a similar demo, except this one would serve as the foundation for Pokémon Pinball. According to Matthew, the demo had 3 pinball tables, which is already one more table than the first 2 games' release versions. The first table represented Sinnoh's countryside, with nature-themed bumpers that looked like plants, bushes, and trees, and the time spent playing pinball in the countryside represented the amount of time it took to travel from one city to the next. As you traveled along the route, different Pokémon would appear on the table, like Diglett bumpers or Pikachu up a tree. You'd hit a Pokémon with the ball to stun it, then use your finger on the touchscreen to tap on the Pokémon, which caught it in the Pokéball. If you didn't tap on the Pokémon fast enough, it would quickly recover and escape. Pokémon would keep popping up until eventually a timer reached 0, which meant you'd been traveling long enough that you'd reach the next city. At that point, the gate to the city appears. Shoot the ball into the gate and you'd enter the city, which was a more traditional pinball table featuring ramps, loops, and bumpers. Catching a decent number of Pokémon was simpler and faster than the older games, so by the time you made your way through the countryside and city tables, you should have collected enough Pokémon to form a team. Then it's time to progress to the demo's 3rd table where you fought against the gym leader. You'd need to decide which Pokémon to take into battle, and Matthew says just like the mainline games, it was to your advantage to consider type matchups like water being strong against fire. The table representing the gym was double-ended, meaning you have a set of flippers on one side, and the gym leader has their set on the opposing side. You can see the gym leader's Pokémon between their flippers, and your Pokémon is between your own flippers. To power up your Pokémon's attacks, you need to perform ramp shots. That's when your ball goes up and around the ramp, then circles back to your flippers. These ramps have spinners, and each time the spinner spins, your Pokémon charges up 1 unit of strength. If you're having a hard time conjuring a mental image, think of the way you power up Pikachu's electricity in the original Game Boy Pinball game. Once your Pokémon's powered up, you fire your ball into a hole in the table called a lock shot, which unleashes an attack from your Pokémon, stretching across the table to hit the gym leader's Pokémon. This double-ended gym table only has 1 ball, so if you lose control of it, the gym leader gets the opportunity to power up their own attacks. The leaked spreadsheet lists Diamond and Pearl Pinball as having Wi-Fi functionality, and according to Matthew, it would have been used for a multiplayer mode with gameplay that functioned just like the gym battles. By the way, that leaked Nintendo spreadsheet just used the temporary title Pokémon Pinball. To avoid confusion with the original Game Boy entry, we've been calling it Diamond and Pearl Pinball, similar to how the sequel was called Ruby and Sapphire. But that's just an assumption on our part. As far as we can tell, the game's title was never finalized. Matthew told us the representatives from Nintendo and the Pokémon Company were really impressed with the demo, but for some reason they never greenlit the project for full production. So unfortunately, development never continued past the demo stage. He says one of the things that made Fuse such a great place to work was that every staff member was present for all meetings and decision-making. But the one exception was meetings about financial matters. He suspects the game was never greenlit due to contract issues, so he wasn't privy to the exact details of why it didn't get picked up. Fuse Games went out of business in 2009, partly because their deal for Pokemon Pinball fell through, and unfortunately Fuse's former owners were unwilling to share those specifics with us. On the plus side though, Matthew was happy to share some information beyond what was included in the demo, and what features the game probably would have included had it continued into development. The first 2 Pokemon Pinball games had Rumble support, and Metroid Prime Pinball came bundled with a Rumble pack you plugged into the GBA slot. Matthew assumes they would have included the same Rumble pack with Diamond and Pearl Pinball, although it's possible they would have come up with a brand new accessory, like how Fuse's next game, Active Health, came packaged with a pedometer. The earlier pinball titles had an evolution mechanic that played out similar to the catch mechanic. Fuse's game wouldn't have used the same formula, and the demo didn't allow for evolution, but the final game definitely would have had its own system for evolving your Pokemon. The original Pokemon Pinball on Game Boy switched between the top and bottom halves of the pinball table depending on where your ball was at, which sometimes made it difficult to aim at locks and bumpers on the side you couldn't see. Ruby and Sapphire Pinball on GBA solved that problem by scrolling the camera up and down, but some players complained of motion sickness. The DS game wouldn't have suffered from either issue, since just like Metroid Prime Pinball, a full table can be displayed on the DS's top and bottom screens all at once. If it hadn't gotten cancelled, we might have seen a new Pokemon Pinball on each successive handheld. First the Game Boy, then the GBA, DS, 3DS, and eventually the Switch. But after Fuse's entry failed to make it past the finish line, it seems the series is well and truly dead. As for where that demo is now, well, it's probably out there somewhere. We asked Matthew if it might have been lost to time after Fuse went out of business, and he told us there's no way it's lost. Nintendo paid for its development, so it's their property and must still be in their possession. We figured if it's on Nintendo's servers, it might have been part of the infamous 2018 hack that produced all those Pokemon beta leaks over the past few years. We reached out to a contact of ours who's friends with the hacker and was actively involved with the leaks, and when we asked if he'd seen the ROM for Pokemon Pinball DS and the hack data, he said no. So unfortunately, we might never get a chance to see the demo in all its glory, but at least we have Matthew Nightingale's story. Who knows, maybe someday fans will turn his story into a ROM hack and finish the job Fuse couldn't finish themselves. If that ever happens, we'll make sure to let you know in a future video. Did you also know that instead of red and green, Pokemon's creator originally wanted to make 65,535 different versions of Gen 1? Or that he got the idea for Mew from an F4 Phantom hidden in the internal data of an arcade game? If you want to hear more Pokemon developer stories, click one of the videos on screen. Thanks for watching.